The morning mist clung to the forest floor like ghostly fingers as Marcus adjusted his worn leather pack. He had been tracking the elk herd for 3 days, moving silently through the dense woodland that stretched endlessly beyond his village. His weathered hands gripped the carved wooden bow that had belonged to his father, and before that his grandfather. At 42, Marcus was considered one of the finest hunters in the mountain settlements, but today felt different somehow. The sound of breaking twigs made him freeze. Through the undergrowth, another figure emerged, tall, lean, with silver-streaked hair and eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of countless seasons. The stranger wore simple clothes made from animal hide, and a young child, barely 3 years old, clung to his back in a woven carrier. "You hunt alone," the stranger observed, his voice carrying a strange accent that Marcus couldn't place. The child stirred slightly, making soft sleeping sounds against the man's shoulder. Marcus studied the newcomer carefully. Something about him seemed familiar, though he was certain they had never met. "The village needs meat before winter sets in properly," Marcus replied, lowering his bow slightly but keeping his guard up. "These woods can be dangerous for travelers with children." The stranger smiled, but there was sadness in his expression. "Dangerous, yes, but not in the way most people think." He shifted the sleeping child gently, and Marcus noticed the careful, practiced way he moved, like someone who had spent years carrying precious cargo. "I am Elias," the stranger said, extending his hand, "and this little one is my daughter, Vera. We have been walking for many days seeking a place where she might grow up safely." Marcus hesitated before shaking the offered hand. The man's grip was firm, calloused from years of outdoor work. "Marcus, I know every family within 50 miles of here, but I don't recognize you. Where do you come from?" Elias looked toward the distant mountains, their peaks shrouded in clouds. "From a place that no longer exists," he said quietly. "Our village wasn't destroyed. Vera and I are all that remain." The child stirred again, opening bright green eyes that seemed far too alert for someone so young. She looked directly at Marcus with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. There was something almost ancient in her gaze, as if she understood far more than any 3-year-old should. "She's beautiful," Marcus said, though the words felt inadequate. The child continued to stare at him, unblinking. "She is special," Elias agreed, his voice filled with both pride and worry. "More special than I sometimes wish she was. It makes our journey complicated." Marcus noticed how Elias's eyes constantly scanned the forest around them, as if expecting danger to emerge from any shadow. The man carried no visible weapons, but his posture suggested he was ready to fight or flee at a moment's notice. "What kind of destruction?" Marcus asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Elias was quiet for a long moment. The only sounds were the distant calls of birds and the soft whisper of wind through the trees. "The kind that comes when people fear what they don't understand," he finally said. "When they decide that different means dangerous." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. He had heard whispers from other settlements, stories of villages burned, families scattered, children who showed unusual abilities being hunted by those who called themselves purifiers. He had always hoped such tales were exaggerated. "The child," Marcus said carefully. "What makes her special?" Elias's protective instincts flared visibly. His arm tightened around the carrier and his eyes hardened. "Why do you ask?" "Because if you're running from the kind of people I think you're running from, then you need to know that my village might not be safe either. We've had visitors, men asking questions about children, about families with unusual gifts." The revelation seemed to drain some of the tension from Elias's shoulders, replacing it with exhaustion. "How recent were these visitors?" 2 weeks ago. They stayed one night, asked their questions, and moved on when no one could give them the answers they wanted. But they said they would return." Vera suddenly reached out toward Marcus, her small hand opening and closing as if she wanted him to come closer. When Elias noticed, his expression grew troubled. "She doesn't usually warm to strangers," he murmured. "In fact, she's been afraid of almost everyone since—" He didn't finish the sentence. Marcus found himself stepping closer despite his better judgment. The child's green eyes seemed to look right through him, and for a moment he felt dizzy. Images flashed through his mind. His own son Thomas, barely a year old, sleeping peacefully in his cradle back in the village. His wife, Sarah, tending their small garden, unaware of the conversation happening in these distant woods. "You have a family, Elias said suddenly. It wasn't a question. Marcus jerked back, startled. How did you— Vera sometimes shows people things, Elias explained apologetically. She doesn't mean to. She's too young to control it. The pieces began falling into place in Marcus's mind. The destroyed village, the men asking questions, the child's strange abilities. He looked at Vera again, seeing her not just as a beautiful child but as someone whose very existence put her in constant danger. The pursuers, Marcus said slowly. They're still looking for you. Elias nodded grimly. They believe children like Vera are dangerous. They think her abilities are somehow evil, something that needs to be eliminated before it can spread. Marcus thought of his own son, sleeping safely at home. What would he do if Thomas showed signs of unusual gifts? Would he have the courage to protect him the way Elias was protecting Vera? There's something else, Elias continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Vera isn't the only one. There are others scattered across the mountains. Children with different gifts, all being hunted by the same group. The weight of this revelation settled on Marcus like a heavy cloak. He realized he was standing at a crossroads. He could walk away, return to his hunting, pretend this conversation never happened. Or he could get involved in something that would change his life forever. Vera made a soft cooing sound and reached for him again. This time, when their eyes met, Marcus saw something that made his decision for him. In her young face he saw the future, not just hers, but his son's and all the children who might be born with gifts that others feared. Your offspring must be led forward, Marcus said quietly, remembering an old saying his grandmother used to recite. Mine is yet too young, still nursing. Elias's eyes widened with recognition and something that might have been hope. The words hung in the air between them like a sacred promise. Elias stared at Marcus with an expression of disbelief mixed with desperate hope. You know the old phrases, he whispered. How is that possible? Marcus felt his heart racing. The saying had been passed down through his family for generations, though no one had ever explained its true meaning. His grandmother would whisper it during thunderstorms when she thought the children weren't listening. His mother had said it once when Marcus was fevered as a child, and he had dreamed strange dreams of lights dancing in his hands. My grandmother, Marcus said slowly. She used to say there would come a time when the words would matter again, when children with gifts would need protection, and those who remembered the old ways would have to choose sides. Vera suddenly became agitated, squirming in her carrier and making soft whimpering sounds. Elias immediately began rocking gently, making soothing sounds, but his eyes never left Marcus's face. The network still exists, Elias said, his voice filled with wonder. We thought it had been destroyed along with everything else. How many others remember? I don't know, Marcus admitted. My grandmother died when I was 15. She never told me what the words really meant, only that they were important. I thought they were just family tradition. The sound of distant horses made them both freeze. Through the trees, Marcus could see dust rising on the main road that wound through the valley below. Elias's face went pale and he began moving quickly but quietly deeper into the forest. They found us again, he whispered urgently. They always find us. Marcus grabbed his arm. Wait, how many riders? They crouched behind a fallen log, watching as a group of 6 horsemen came into view. They wore dark traveling clothes and carried themselves with military precision. Even from this distance, Marcus could see the cold efficiency in their movements as they examined the ground for tracks. The purifiers, Elias breathed. They've been hunting us for 3 months. Every time we think we've lost them, they appear again. Vera had gone completely silent, as if she understood the danger. Her small hands clutched at her father's shirt, and her bright eyes were wide with fear. Marcus studied the riders carefully. He recognized their type, men who believed they were doing righteous work, eliminating what they saw as corruption or evil. He had met their kind before, though never in such organized numbers. They're tracking you specifically, Marcus observed. That's not random searching. They know exactly where you've been. Elias nodded miserably. Vera's abilities leave traces. People who are sensitive can follow them like footprints. We can never stay hidden for long. One of the riders had dismounted and was examining the ground near where Marcus and Elias had first met. The man's head suddenly snapped up, looking directly toward their hiding spot. Marcus felt a chill of recognition. He had seen that same predatory alertness in the wolves that sometimes hunted near his village. He knows we're here, Marcus whispered. Not us, Elias corrected grimly. Her. They can sense her from quite a distance now that her powers are growing stronger. The mounted man raised his hand, signaling to his companions. 3 of them began moving up the hillside toward the forest while the others spread out to block escape routes. Marcus made a decision that surprised him with its certainty. "Follow me," he said quietly. "I know these woods better than anyone. There's a place we can hide." They moved quickly through the undergrowth, Marcus leading them along paths that were barely visible even to his trained eyes. Behind them he could hear the purifiers crashing through the forest with much less skill but determined persistence. The hiding place Marcus had in mind was a cave system his father had shown him years ago. The entrance was concealed behind a waterfall, and the caves extended deep into the mountainside. More importantly, the sound of rushing water would mask any noise they made. They reached the waterfall just as shouts echoed from the forest behind them. Marcus led Elias behind the curtain of water, into a narrow opening that widened into a substantial cavern. The space was dry and had been used as a shelter by hunters for generations. Vera had remained silent throughout their escape, but now she began to glow faintly in the darkness of the cave. Her skin emitted a soft silver light that illuminated the cavern walls. "That's new," Elias said worriedly. "She's never done that before." Marcus stared in fascination. The child's abilities were clearly growing stronger, but rather than feeling afraid, he found himself filled with a sense of awe. This was what the purifiers feared. A 3-year-old child whose worst crime was being born different. "How long have you been running?" Marcus asked. "Since she was 6 months old," Elias replied, exhaustion clear in his voice. "They came for us in the middle of the night. Burned our village. Killed anyone who tried to protect the children. Vera and I escaped only because my wife—" He stopped, unable to continue. Marcus understood. The cost of protection had been high. Outside, they could hear the purifiers searching, their voices growing more frustrated as they lost the trail. One man shouted orders about checking every cave and hollow in the area. Marcus realized they would be found eventually if they stayed here. "There's something you need to know," Marcus said quietly. "About my village, about my family." Elias looked at him questioningly. "My son, Thomas. He's only a year old, but sometimes—" Marcus struggled with words he had never spoken aloud. "Sometimes toys move when he looks at them. Small things float around his cradle. My wife thinks it's just drafts in the house, but I know better." The revelation hung between them like a bridge. Elias studied Marcus's face carefully, perhaps seeing him clearly for the first time. "The gifts run in bloodlines," Elias said slowly. "If your son shows signs, then you or your wife carries the potential. The purifiers won't stop with Vera. Eventually, they'll come for every family, every child who shows even the slightest ability." Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He thought of Sarah, nursing their son in their peaceful cottage, unaware that their quiet life might be about to change forever. "What do we do?" Marcus asked. "We protect them," Elias said simply. "All of them. The old network, the families who remember the phrases, the children who will need safe places to grow up. We fight back." Vera's glow was growing brighter, and Marcus realized she was responding to their conversation, as if she understood that they were talking about her future. The sound of horses moving away filtered through the waterfall. The purifiers were expanding their search to other areas, giving them temporary safety. "Your offspring must be led forward," Marcus repeated the ancient phrase. "Mine is yet too young, still nursing. But not too young to be in danger," Elias finished. "Not too young to need protection." Marcus knew his life had just changed irrevocably. There would be no going back to simple hunting trips and quiet evenings by the fire. The war for the gifted children had found him, and he had chosen his side. They waited in the cave until darkness fell completely. Vera had finally fallen asleep in her father's arms, her strange glow fading to barely visible pulses like a slow heartbeat. Marcus found himself mesmerized by the gentle light, wondering what other abilities might manifest as she grew older. "We need to reach my village tonight," Marcus whispered. "There are people there who might remember the old ways. My wife's grandmother was known for her intuition, and the blacksmith Garrett sometimes knows things before they happen." Elias nodded but looked troubled. Bringing Vera near other gifted individuals might make her abilities stronger. That could draw the purifiers directly to your home. The dilemma was clear. They needed allies, but gathering the gifted together increased the danger for everyone. Marcus thought of his peaceful village, imagining it burned and empty like Elias's had been. "There's another choice," Marcus said slowly. "We could split up. You continue running with Vera and I go back to warn my people. Start building the network again from different directions." "No," Elias said firmly. "The old phrase binds us together now. Your offspring and mine. Their fates are connected. Besides," he added with a sad smile, "Vera has chosen you. Look." Marcus followed his gaze and saw that even in sleep, the child's hand was stretched toward him, her small fingers glowing faintly. He felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness toward this little girl he had just met. "She's never done that with anyone before," Elias continued. "Not since her mother died. I think she recognizes something in you, some connection to the gift that runs in your family line." They prepared to leave the cave carefully. Marcus had memorized the patrol patterns of the purifiers during their hours of hiding. The riders seemed to work in shifts, with some watching the main roads while others searched the forest. Their coordination suggested military training and substantial resources. The journey to Marcus's village would take 3 hours on foot through difficult terrain. With a small child, it would be longer and more dangerous. But staying in the wilderness was no longer an option. The purifiers had tracking abilities that made it impossible to hide indefinitely. They emerged from behind the waterfall into a night filled with stars. The moon was only a thin crescent, providing enough light to see but not enough to make them easily visible to distant watchers. Marcus led them along a path that followed the ridgeline, staying in the tree cover while maintaining good visibility of the valley below. After an hour of careful walking, they came across something that made Marcus's blood run cold. A burned farmhouse sat in a small clearing, smoke still rising from the ruins. The destruction was recent, probably from that very afternoon. "The Patterson family," Marcus whispered. "They had a daughter about Vera's age." Elias moved closer to examine the scene. His face was grim when he returned. "No bodies. They might have escaped or—" He didn't finish the thought. Vera stirred in her carrier, opening her eyes and looking directly at the burned ruins. For a moment her glow intensified, and Marcus could swear he saw shapes moving in the light. Ghostly figures of a fleeing family. "She can see echoes," Elias explained quietly. "Traces of strong emotions left behind in places. The Pattersons ran that way." He pointed toward a path that led deeper into the mountains. The implications were staggering. If Vera could track emotional echoes, she might be able to help them find other survivors. But it also meant the purifiers might not have been simply following her trail. They might have been systematically destroying any family that showed signs of harboring gifted individuals. "How many villages?" Marcus asked, dreading the answer. "In the past month? 7 that I know of. Probably more." Elias's voice was heavy with grief. "They're not just hunting individual children anymore. They're trying to eliminate entire bloodlines, whole communities that might carry the genetic potential." Marcus thought of his own village, of the families he had known since childhood. How many of them might carry dormant gifts? How many children might develop abilities as they grew? The purifiers weren't just conducting a hunt. They were orchestrating a genocide. They continued toward the village with new urgency. Every delay could mean more deaths, more families destroyed. But they also had to be careful not to lead the hunters directly to the people they were trying to protect. As they crested the final hill before his village, Marcus saw lights in windows that should have been dark at this hour. The entire community seemed to be awake, and he could see figures moving between the houses with lanterns. "Something's wrong," he said. They approached carefully, using the cover of his neighbor's barn to get close enough to hear voices. What Marcus heard made his heart pound with fear. "Search every house again," a commanding voice ordered. "The tracker says the trail leads here. One of these families is hiding something." Marcus recognized the voice of Captain Heinrich, the purifier leader who had visited 2 weeks earlier. Somehow they had returned and brought more men. The village was surrounded. Through a crack in the barn wall, Marcus could see armed men systematically searching each building. They were being thorough and professional, checking every hiding place, questioning every resident. "My family," Marcus whispered desperately. His cottage was at the far end of the village, and he could see lantern light moving through his windows. Elias grabbed his arm. "Wait, going in now will only get everyone killed." But as they watched, Marcus saw something that made him forget caution. A soldier emerged from his cottage carrying a bundle. his son Thomas, crying and reaching for someone inside the house. "Sarah," Marcus breathed, starting forward before Elias could stop him. At that moment, Vera's glow suddenly blazed like a small sun. Her light was so bright it penetrated the barn walls, and every person in the village stopped what they were doing to stare in their direction. "Found them," Captain Heinrich shouted. The moment of discovery had arrived sooner than anyone expected. The careful plans for infiltration and rescue were abandoned as pure instinct took over. Marcus sprinted toward his cottage while Elias ran in the opposite direction, trying to draw the pursuers away from the village center. But Vera had other plans. Her light pulsed once, twice, and suddenly, every gifted individual in the village began to glow with their own inner radiance. Children who had never shown abilities before were suddenly surrounded by dancing lights. Adults who had hidden their gifts for decades found power flowing through them like a river breaking through a dam. The village had become a beacon of supernatural energy, and there was no hiding anymore. Marcus reached his cottage just as a soldier was dragging Sarah outside. When the man saw Marcus approaching, he drew his sword. But Thomas chose that moment to demonstrate his own awakening abilities. Every metal object in a 50-foot radius, swords, armor, horseshoes, and tools, suddenly flew toward the child like iron drawn to a magnet. The battle for the gifted children had begun, and it would determine the fate of everyone Marcus loved. Chaos erupted throughout the village as metal objects flew through the air like deadly birds. The purifiers, caught completely off guard by the sudden manifestation of multiple gifts, scrambled for cover while trying to maintain their formation. Captain Heinrich shouted orders, but his voice was nearly drowned out by the sound of clashing metal and the cries of frightened villagers. Marcus dove toward his cottage as a sword blade whistled past his ear. Drawn by his son's uncontrolled magnetic pull, Sarah stood in the doorway clutching Thomas protectively, her eyes wide with terror and amazement as she watched their baby son command forces beyond understanding. "Sarah, get back inside," Marcus yelled, but she was frozen in place, watching her child's impossible display of power. The soldier who had been threatening them was now pinned against the cottage wall by his own armor, unable to move as the metal plates pressed him firmly against the wooden planks. His sword had flown from his hand to join a growing orbit of metallic objects circling around the baby. Across the village square, Elias was running between houses while Vera's brilliant glow seemed to be triggering awakening after awakening. The baker's teenage daughter suddenly rose 3 feet off the ground, floating above the chaos with her arms spread wide. Old Henrik, the village elder, was gesturing with his hands and causing the earth itself to ripple and shift, making it impossible for the mounted purifiers to maintain their positions. This is what they feared, Marcus realized with sudden clarity. Not individual children with small gifts, but an entire community awakening together. Their combined abilities creating a force that no army could easily defeat. Captain Heinrich had regrouped his men near the center of the village, using overturned carts as shields against the flying metal. "Containment formation," he bellowed. "Surround them before they can coordinate." But coordination was happening naturally. The gifted villagers seemed to instinctively understand how to work together. The floating girl, Emma, began lifting other children out of harm's way, carrying them to rooftops where they would be safe. Henrik's earth manipulation created barriers that protected the non-gifted families while channeling the purifiers into predictable paths. Marcus reached his family and pulled them inside the cottage. Thomas had finally stopped crying, seemingly fascinated by the swirling metal objects that followed his gaze. When he looked at the iron pot hanging by the fireplace, it gently floated over to him. When he turned toward the window, all the metal objects shifted direction like a school of fish following a current. "How long has he been able to do this?" Marcus asked Sarah, though he was already guessing the answer. "It started tonight," she said wonderingly. "Just after the soldiers arrived." He began crying, and then the spoons in the kitchen started moving. "I thought I was imagining it until—" She gestured helplessly at the metallic tornado surrounding their son. Through the window, Marcus could see Elias making his way toward them, Vera's light still blazing like a beacon. The little girl seemed to be in some kind of trance, her abilities flowing outward in waves that touched every person with latent gifts. She's a catalyst, Marcus realized. Her power doesn't just manifest on its own. It awakens the abilities in others. That explained why the purifiers had been so desperate to find her. Vera wasn't just another gifted child. She was the key to activating an entire generation of dormant abilities. In the right circumstances, she could transform ordinary villages into communities of the gifted overnight. A crossbow bolt shattered the window, and Marcus pulled Sarah and Thomas away from the opening. Outside, Captain Heinrich had organized his men into a more disciplined assault. They were using fire arrows now, trying to drive the defenders out of their positions. "We can't stay here," Marcus said. "They'll burn us out." But as he spoke, something extraordinary happened. Emma, the floating baker's daughter, began gathering water from the village well, lifting it in impossible quantities, and directing it toward the burning arrows before they could catch anything ablaze. Her control was perfect, extinguishing each threat without wasting a drop. The tide of battle was turning. What had begun as a raid by trained soldiers against helpless villagers had become a conflict between two very different kinds of power. The purifiers had weapons and experience, but the awakened villagers had abilities that defied conventional warfare. Elias finally reached the cottage, stumbling through the door with Vera still glowing in his arms. The little girl's eyes were completely white now, as if she was looking at something far beyond the immediate battle. "We have to leave," Elias said urgently. "All of us together." "Leave?" Sarah asked. "This is our home. These are our people. Your people are coming with us," Elias replied. "Don't you see? This isn't just about Vera anymore or about Thomas. Every awakened individual in this village is now a target. The purifiers will call for reinforcements, bring siege equipment, whatever it takes to eliminate this threat." Marcus understood. The battle they were winning tonight was just the beginning of a much larger war. The village could never return to its peaceful isolation. Everyone with gifts would have to choose between hiding forever or joining a growing resistance. Outside, Captain Heinrich was making the same calculation. Marcus could hear him shouting to his men about retreat and regrouping. The purifiers were professional enough to recognize when a situation had become untenable. "Fall back to the staging area," Heinrich commanded. "Send word to headquarters. Request siege equipment and flame troops. We'll return at dawn with enough force to level this entire settlement." The immediate threat was withdrawing, but Marcus knew Elias was right. They had perhaps 6 hours before a much larger force arrived, one that wouldn't be caught off guard by unexpected abilities. Vera's glow began to fade, and her eyes returned to normal. She looked around the cottage with the confused expression of a child waking from a deep sleep, as if she had no memory of the power she had just unleashed. "Daddy," she said in a small voice. The lights were so pretty. The innocence in her words was heartbreaking. She had no idea that her pretty lights had just changed the course of history, awakening abilities that had been dormant for generations and transforming a quiet mountain village into the first stronghold of a magical resistance. Marcus looked at his son, still peacefully playing with floating kitchen utensils, then at his wife, who was beginning to understand that their old life was over forever. Outside, he could hear the awakened villagers calling to each other, sharing amazement and fear in equal measure. "Where do we go?" Marcus asked. Elias smiled for the first time since Marcus had met him. "To gather the others. Every village that's been attacked, every family that's been scattered, every child who's been forced to hide their gifts. Tonight proved that we're stronger together than any of us imagined." The evacuation began immediately. The villagers worked with new purpose, gathering essential supplies while the gifted individuals practiced controlling their newfound abilities. They had until dawn to disappear into the mountains, and then the real journey would begin. Marcus packed his hunting gear and family belongings, knowing he might never see his cottage again. But as he watched Thomas happily floating a wooden toy horse around the room, he realized he wasn't losing his home. He was helping to build a new one, where children like his son could grow up without fear. The resistance had found its catalyst, and there was no turning back. The exodus from the village began in the darkest hour before dawn. 43 people, including 12 newly awakened, gifted individuals, moved through the forest like ghosts, carrying their entire lives in hastily packed bundles. Marcus led the way, using his hunting knowledge to find paths that would leave minimal traces, while Elias brought up the rear, constantly scanning for signs of pursuit. Thomas rode in a carrier similar to Vera's, fashioned quickly by the village carpenter. The baby seemed delighted by the adventure, occasionally causing small metal objects to float around him like playful companions. Sarah walked beside Marcus, her face set with determination, despite the exhaustion that showed in her eyes. Emma, the baker's daughter who had discovered her ability to fly, served as their scout. She would rise above the tree canopy every few miles, checking for signs of the purifier force that everyone knew would be coming. Her reports were consistently grim. More soldiers arriving at the village throughout the night, along with strange equipment she couldn't identify from a distance. Flame weapons, Elias explained when Emma described the wheeled devices being unloaded from wagons. They've used them before. Devices that can project fire over long distances, designed specifically to counter defensive abilities like Henrik's earth manipulation. Henrik himself was struggling with the pace of travel. The elderly man had expended enormous energy during the battle, and his newfound earth-moving abilities seemed to drain him more than anyone expected. But he refused to slow the group, insisting that his gift made him too dangerous to be captured alive. "They'll torture me for information about how the awakening works," he said during a brief rest. "Better to die free in these mountains than give them knowledge they could use against other communities." The group included families who had never traveled beyond the village boundaries, children who didn't understand why they had to leave their homes, and awakened individuals who were still struggling to control their new abilities. The challenge of keeping them together and moving quickly through difficult terrain seemed almost impossible. But Marcus noticed something remarkable happening as the hours passed. The gifted individuals were learning to use their abilities cooperatively, solving problems that would have stopped a normal group of refugees. When the path became too steep for the elderly and small children, Emma and two other newly awakened individuals who could manipulate air currents created a gentle lifting force that helped everyone climb. When they needed to cross a fast-moving stream, Henrik shaped the riverbank into a natural bridge. Most impressive was how they handled the problem of tracks. Every few hundred yards, Henrik would cause the earth to shift slightly, erasing footprints and redistributing soil to eliminate signs of their passage. Meanwhile, a teenage boy named Peter, who had discovered he could influence plant growth, encouraged vegetation to spring up behind them, creating the appearance that the forest floor had been undisturbed for weeks. "The network," Elias said to Marcus as they walked. "This is how it must have worked in the old days. Communities of gifted individuals helping each other, sharing knowledge, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves." Marcus was beginning to understand the true scope of what his grandmother's generation had lost. This wasn't just about children with unusual abilities. It was about an entirely different way of living, where supernatural gifts were integrated into daily life and used for the common good. They reached their first destination at midday, a hidden valley that Marcus's grandfather had shown him as a child. The elderly hunter had claimed it was a place where special folk used to gather, though he had never explained what made them special. Now Marcus understood. The valley contained the ruins of what had once been a substantial settlement. Stone foundations outlined buildings that could have housed hundreds of people, and carefully engineered channels showed where streams had been diverted to create a sophisticated water system. Most tellingly, some of the stonework showed clear evidence of supernatural construction. Blocks fitted together so perfectly that no mortar was needed, surfaces polished to mirror smoothness without tool marks. "A sanctuary," Elias breathed, walking among the ruins with wonder. "I've heard stories of places like this, but I never believed they really existed." Vera ran among the fallen stones, laughing with delight. Wherever she stepped, tiny flowers bloomed instantly, as if the earth itself remembered the joy of harboring gifted children. Thomas, inspired by his companion's example, began making the metal buckles and fittings on everyone's packs chime in musical harmonies. But the valley also told a darker story. Scorch marks on some of the stones suggested the settlement had been destroyed by fire, and Emma, using her aerial perspective, reported finding what looked like mass graves at the far end of the valley. "The first purge," Henrik said quietly. He was examining carved symbols on one of the larger stones, symbols that seemed to shift and change as he watched them. "My grandmother used to tell stories about it. A time when fear overcame understanding, and the gifted were blamed for every misfortune." Marcus realized they were standing in the graveyard of their people's past, a reminder of what happened when the gifted tried to live openly without sufficient protection. The sanctuary had been built with hope and destroyed with hatred, its people scattered or killed for the crime of being different. "We won't make the same mistakes," Sarah said firmly. holding Thomas closer as she studied the ruins. "This time we'll be ready." Elias was examining what appeared to be a well at the center of the settlement. When he touched the stone rim, symbols began glowing faintly, responding to his presence. "There's something down there," he said. "Something that survived the destruction." Emma volunteered to investigate, using her flying ability to descend into the well shaft. Her excited shouts echoed up from the depths, and when she emerged, she was carrying a wrapped bundle that had been protected in a sealed chamber. Inside the bundle were books, dozens of them, written in various hands and languages, but all dealing with the same subject: the cultivation and training of supernatural abilities, the history of the gifted communities, and most importantly, detailed maps showing the locations of other sanctuaries throughout the mountain region. "This is how we rebuild," Marcus said, studying a map that showed at least 20 other hidden settlements. Some were marked as destroyed, but others bore symbols indicating they might still be active. The books revealed that the old network had been far more extensive than anyone realized. There had been trading routes between gifted communities, standardized methods for training children with abilities, and sophisticated systems for identifying and rescuing those who showed signs of supernatural gifts. Most fascinating were the passages dealing with catalyst children like Vera. According to the ancient texts, such individuals appeared roughly once in a generation, their abilities serving to awaken and strengthen the gifts in others. They were considered sacred, protected at all costs, and their presence in a community was seen as a sign of great fortune. "No wonder the purifiers hunt them so desperately," Elias said, reading over Marcus's shoulder. "A single catalyst child could awaken an entire province if given the chance." The afternoon was spent studying the texts and planning their next moves. The map showed a sanctuary called Haven's Rest, located 3 days' travel to the north, which was marked as still active as recently as 50 years ago. If it still existed, it would provide shelter and resources for their growing group. But as evening approached, Emma's scouting flights brought disturbing news. The Purifier force had grown to over 100 soldiers, and they had brought tracking hounds trained to follow supernatural traces. More concerning, they had split into multiple groups, systematically searching every possible escape route from the village. "They're not just hunting us randomly," Marcus realized. "They have maps, too, probably captured from other destroyed communities. They know about the old sanctuary network." The group faced a critical decision. They could try to reach Haven's Rest, but doing so would risk leading the Purifiers to another community of gifted individuals. Alternatively, they could continue wandering, but that would eventually result in capture or death from exposure in the wilderness. Henrik proposed a third option. "We make our stand here," he said. "This valley is defensible. It has water and shelter, and the old protective enchantments might still be active. More importantly, if we're going to fight for our right to exist, we should do it in a place that honors our ancestors." The proposal sparked intense debate. Some argued for continuing to run, especially those with young children. Others, particularly the newly awakened, wanted to fight back against their persecutors. The decision ultimately came down to a simple question: what kind of future did they want to build for their children? "Running worked for a while," Elias said, "but tonight showed us that hiding isn't enough anymore. They'll keep hunting us, keep destroying communities until every gifted child is dead or captured. Maybe it's time to stop running and start building something permanent." As if responding to the discussion, Vera suddenly ran to the center of the ruined settlement and placed her small hands on the stone well. Her glow returned, brighter than ever, and the ancient symbols carved throughout the valley began awakening, pulsing with warm light that seemed to welcome them home. Thomas laughed and clapped his hands, causing every piece of metal in the settlement to ring like bells. The sound echoed off the valley walls, creating a music that seemed to sing of hope and defiance. The gifted had found their sanctuary, and this time, they would be ready when the Purifiers came calling. The decision to make their stand in the ancient valley transformed the refugee group into something else entirely: a community with purpose. Throughout the night, they worked to prepare defenses, using both practical knowledge and supernatural abilities to turn the ruins into a fortress. Henrik's earth manipulation proved invaluable for creating barriers and obstacles. He raised stone walls at strategic points around the valley entrance, leaving narrow passages that could be easily defended. More impressively, he managed to awaken some of the old protective enchantments, causing certain stones to pulse with warning energy when strangers approached. Emma and the other air manipulators worked to create elevated positions and escape routes. They carved handholds into cliff faces and established a network of high platforms that would allow defenders to move quickly between positions. Peter used his plant growth abilities to camouflage these positions with thick vegetation that could hide defenders while still allowing clear views of approaching enemies. The books from the well provided crucial tactical information. The ancient gifted had faced similar persecution and had developed sophisticated defensive strategies. Marcus learned about creating ability circles, groups of gifted individuals whose powers complemented each other perfectly. He also discovered that the valley's layout had been specifically designed to channel and amplify supernatural abilities. Sarah surprised everyone by revealing her own hidden gift during the preparations. When Thomas became fussy and difficult to calm, she began humming a wordless melody that seemed to have an immediate soothing effect, not just on her son, but on everyone within hearing distance. Her voice could influence emotions, creating calm in the midst of chaos or inspiring courage when it was needed most. The gift often runs stronger in the maternal line, Elias explained. Your son's mental manipulation and your emotional influence together make a powerful combination. He affects the physical world, you affect the human heart. As dawn approached, their preparations were tested. Emma's aerial reconnaissance revealed the purifier force approaching the valley in 3 separate columns, timing their arrival to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. Captain Heinrich had learned from his previous encounter and was taking no chances. The defenders took their positions as the first column came into view. Marcus found himself stationed at the main entrance with Henrik and 2 other Earth manipulators, while Sarah remained in the center of the valley with the children and non-combatants, her voice ready to provide emotional support to the fighters. The purifiers advanced cautiously, clearly expecting traps. Their caution was justified. Henrik had prepared several unpleasant surprises. When the lead soldiers stepped onto what appeared to be solid ground, the earth suddenly became as soft as quicksand, trapping them up to their waists. When they tried to retreat, stone barriers rose behind them, cutting off their escape. But Captain Heinrich had brought new weapons to counter supernatural defenses. Strange devices mounted on wheeled platforms began projecting streams of liquid fire that burned even stone. The flames seemed specifically designed to disrupt magical energies, causing the protective enchantments to flicker and fail. Iron fire, Elias called out, recognizing the weapons from previous encounters. They've learned to forge flames with metal particles. It disrupts our abilities and burns through most defenses. The battle quickly became a deadly chess match between conventional military tactics and supernatural creativity. The purifiers used disciplined formations and superior numbers, while the defenders relied on abilities that could reshape the battlefield itself. Emma and her fellow flyers attacked from above, dropping stones and using wind manipulation to disrupt the enemy's aim. But the purifiers had crossbows designed for aerial targets, and Emma narrowly avoided being shot down during her first attack run. Thomas, safe in the center of the valley, began crying as the sounds of battle frightened him. His distress triggered his magnetic abilities on a scale that surprised everyone. Every piece of metal armor and weaponry within a quarter-mile radius suddenly became impossibly heavy, dragging soldiers to their knees and making it nearly impossible for them to move. "Hold that feeling," Sarah called to her son, somehow understanding that his emotional state was connected to the strength of his abilities. She began singing a lullaby that kept him calm but not completely happy, maintaining just enough distress to keep the metal manipulation active. The tide of battle shifted as the purifiers found themselves fighting in armor that weighed hundreds of pounds and carrying weapons they could barely lift. But Captain Heinrich had prepared for this possibility too. A 4th column of soldiers approached from an unexpected direction, men wearing leather armor and carrying wooden weapons, unaffected by Thomas's magnetic field. These soldiers also carried something else: children. Captured gifted children from other destroyed communities, held as hostages to force the defenders' surrender. "Stop fighting or the children die," Heinrich shouted across the valley. "You have 1 minute to lay down your weapons and surrender yourselves." The moral complexity of the situation hit Marcus like a physical blow. They had the power to win this battle, but doing so would cost the lives of innocent children. The defenders found themselves frozen in an impossible choice. But Vera, who had been quiet throughout the battle, suddenly walked forward. Her small form glowed brighter than anyone had ever seen, and her voice carried clearly across the entire valley despite her young age. "Let them go," she said, speaking directly to Captain Heinrich. "They're scared and they want their families." What happened next would be remembered for generations. Vera's glow extended outward like ripples in a pond, touching each of the captive children. One by one, they began manifesting their own abilities. Not the gentle awakenings that had occurred in Marcus's village, but explosive releases of power fueled by fear and desperation. The purifier soldiers holding them suddenly found themselves grappling with children who could become intangible, or who burst into flames, or who could make the ground beneath their feet disappear. The carefully planned hostage situation dissolved into chaos as the children freed themselves and began running toward the safety of the valley. "Your offspring must be led forward," Marcus called out to Elias, understanding finally what the ancient phrase truly meant. "Mine is yet too young, still nursing." "But old enough to choose courage over fear," Elias replied, watching as Vera continued to glow like a small sun, guiding the rescued children to safety. The battle was far from over, but its character had changed completely. This was no longer just a fight between the gifted and their persecutors. It had become something larger, a declaration that the age of hiding was ending, and the time for standing together had begun. Captain Heinrich's face showed no emotion as he watched his perfect plan unravel. But Marcus could see calculation in his eyes. The Purifier leader was already planning his next move, and Marcus knew this victory was only the beginning of a much longer war. The rescue of the captive children marked a turning point that no one could have anticipated. As the young ones ran toward the valley, their newly awakened abilities created a cascade of chaos among the Purifier ranks. Captain Heinrich's carefully organized assault dissolved into complete disorder as his soldiers found themselves facing opponents who could walk through walls, command the elements, or simply vanish from sight. But Heinrich was not a man who accepted defeat easily. Even as his forces retreated in confusion, he was already issuing new orders. Marcus watched through the valley's defensive positions as the captain gathered his remaining officers and began implementing what appeared to be a final, desperate strategy. "Fire everything," Heinrich commanded, pointing toward the center of the valley where the children and non-combatants had taken shelter. "If we cannot capture them, we will ensure they cannot spread their corruption to others." The iron fire weapons turned toward the heart of the settlement, preparing to unleash flames that would burn everything and everyone in the ancient sanctuary. Marcus realized with horror that Heinrich intended to commit genocide rather than accept failure. The moment called for impossible courage, and it came from an unexpected source. Thomas, barely a year old and still nursing, suddenly stopped crying and looked directly at the threatening weapons. His magnetic abilities, amplified by his mother's emotional influence and Vera's catalytic presence, reached out across the battlefield with precision that defied his age. Every iron fire weapon began to disassemble itself. Bolts unwound, metal plates separated, and the carefully engineered devices fell apart like toys in the hands of a curious child. The streams of flame sputtered and died as their delivery systems collapsed. But Thomas wasn't finished. His power reached further, touching every piece of metal equipment the purifiers possessed. Armor split apart at the joints, weapons crumbled into component pieces, and even the iron shoes on their horses began to dissolve. In minutes, the most feared military force in the region was reduced to men in cloth and leather, armed with nothing more dangerous than wooden clubs. The psychological impact was even greater than the tactical advantage. The Purifier soldiers, who had built their identity around being superior to the cursed children they hunted, found themselves helpless before a baby who could unmake their weapons with a glance. Captain Heinrich, standing in the ruins of his equipment, made one final gesture of defiance. Drawing a wooden knife, he started walking toward the valley center, clearly intending to kill as many children as possible before being stopped. He never reached his targets. Henrik, the elderly earth manipulator, caused the ground beneath Heinrich's feet to open like a mouth, swallowing the captain up to his neck and holding him motionless but alive. The old ways included justice as well as mercy, Henrik said, his voice carrying across the silent battlefield. "You will live to face trial for your crimes, but you will never again raise a hand against children." The surviving purifiers, leaderless and weaponless, began to surrender. But rather than treating them as enemies, the gifted community made a choice that would define their future relationship with the outside world. "Let them go," Elias said, speaking for the group. "Send them back to their superiors with a message. Tell them that the age of persecution is ending. We will defend ourselves, but we offer no threat to those who leave us in peace." Sarah's voice rose in a song that carried impossible distances, ensuring that every purifier soldier would remember this moment clearly. Her melody spoke of sorrow for the conflict, hope for future understanding, and an unshakable determination to protect the innocent. As the defeated soldiers departed, carrying their captured leader and their wounded, the valley began to transform once again. The rescued children, still glowing with newly awakened abilities, started helping to rebuild the settlement with powers that made construction swift and joyful. Marcus stood with Vera and Thomas, watching as the ancient sanctuary came back to life. Stone walls rose smoothly from the earth, guided by Henrik's abilities and shaped by others who could work with metal and wood. Gardens sprouted instantly under Peter's influence, providing food and beauty in equal measure. "Your offspring must be led forward," Marcus said to Elias, finally understanding the full meaning of the phrase. "Mine is yet too young, still nursing." "But not too young to show us the way," Elias replied, watching as Thomas contentedly played with floating toys, while Vera taught the other children how to make flowers bloom with their touch. The books from the ancient well were already being copied and distributed, their knowledge spreading to create new sanctuaries throughout the mountain region. Emma and her flying companions served as messengers, carrying word to scattered communities of gifted individuals that it was safe to emerge from hiding. Within weeks, the valley that had once housed a destroyed settlement became the heart of a growing network. Families arrived daily, some carrying children with obvious abilities, others simply seeking a place where difference was celebrated rather than feared. Marcus established a school for training both abilities and practical skills, recognizing that the gifted would need to be self-sufficient if they were going to build a lasting community. Sarah became the settlement's emotional center, her voice helping to resolve conflicts and maintain harmony among people from many different backgrounds. Henrik worked with the other Earth manipulators to expand the valley's infrastructure, creating homes, workshops, and gathering spaces that could accommodate hundreds of residents. His greatest achievement was restoring the ancient protective enchantments, ensuring that the new sanctuary could defend itself against future threats. The children, both rescued and homegrown, thrived in an environment where their abilities were nurtured rather than suppressed. Thomas learned to control his magnetic gifts with increasing precision, while Vera's role as a catalyst helped other children discover and develop their own unique talents. Most importantly, they began reaching out to the non-gifted world with offerings of friendship and cooperation. The abilities that had once been seen as threats were used to help struggling farming communities, heal the sick, and solve problems that conventional methods couldn't address. The phrase that had started their journey, "Your offspring must be led forward. Mine is yet too young, still nursing," became the motto of their new community. It spoke of shared responsibility, mutual protection, and the understanding that every child, gifted or not, deserved the chance to grow up in safety and love. Marcus often stood at the valley's entrance at sunset, watching children play while their parents worked together to build something unprecedented in human history. A society where supernatural abilities were integrated seamlessly into daily life, where difference was strength rather than danger. The war with the purifiers was far from over, but they had won something more valuable than any single battle. They had proven that the gifted could live openly, defend themselves effectively, and offer something positive to the world. The age of hiding was ending, and the time of integration had begun. In his arms, Thomas gurgled happily, occasionally making his father's hunting knife float in lazy circles. Across the valley, Vera laughed as she helped a group of children paint the walls of the new school with light that would never fade. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but filled with possibility, guided by the understanding that every child, gifted or ordinary, was precious beyond measure and worthy of protection. The network was growing, the sanctuaries were being rebuilt, and hope was finally stronger than fear.